All right, I'm gonna go ahead. So there was some confusion as to whether or not this meeting started at 3 or 3:30, but we've got a quorum now, so.
Nancy's the microphone.
Oh, thank you. I was learning to turn the microphone on. So I'll just repeat, there was some bit of confusion or miscommunication as to whether or not this meeting started at 3 or 3:30. We've got a quorum now, it's 3 minutes to 3:30, and so I'm gonna go ahead and get started because we do have a hard stop at 5:30, okay? All right, well, I'm gonna hereby call to order the third and the final public meeting of the task force for the review of the processes and procedures of the Office of the Inspector General, the Ethics Office, and the Governing Board with the Office of the Inspector General and the Ethics Office. Mr. Pascal, please call the roll to document which of the task force members will be able to join us today.
The Honorable Leonard Sears,
Yes, President.
the Honorable Howard Shipp, the Honorable Marcy Carter Overstreet,
No. Yes.
the Honorable Tanya Miller,
No.
Mr. David Dove,
Present.
Mr. Norman Brothers,
Present.
and Mr. Richard Dean.
Present. Ricky Larkins.
Madam Chair, you have a quorum.
Thank you very much. The meeting agenda was distributed to everyone late last week and published to the public. Do any of my task force members have any additions or modifications to make to the same? Okay, seeing none, I will entertain a motion to approve the agenda as published.
So moved. Second.
All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed? All right, thank you. The minutes of the second meeting of the task force meeting held October 7th were distributed to the task force members late last week for your review and consideration. Does anyone have any corrections or additions to these minutes? Okay, then I will go ahead and entertain a motion to approve the minutes as presented.
So moved. Second.
All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed? Thank you. These minutes will be added to the website listing the activities and the materials received by the task force after today's meeting. Our clerk to the task force has been uploading documents that were disseminated to the task force for review and consideration by the members. We received several materials directly from the OIG, including, I think, a document that was sent a few minutes ago, which weren't acknowledged and approved to be part of our official record. I will entertain a motion now that we adopt for our record all of the documents that have been received to date from all sources, including the materials that we received prior to our last meeting.
So moved. Second.
All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Motion passed. All right, I decided to hold public comment prior to the end of the meeting so that the comments submitted will be able to factor into our discussion, which will take place later on in this meeting. I anticipate that the discussion will take a little while, so I also didn't want citizens to have to wait until the end of the meeting to voice their opinions. Mr. Pascal, with that said, do you have any parties who have signed up for public comment prior to the meeting starting? And if so, could you please identify the first speaker, please?
Yes, we have 4 official signups for public comment. The first individual is Gola Hines.
Okay. You understand you have 2 minutes?
Yes.
Okay, very good. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Nicola Hines. I'm the chairwoman for the governing board of the Office of Inspector General. Thank you for giving me this time. I just want to kind of reiterate some of the key points that myself and some of my board members presented last time. We are looking at to improve oversight for the board, that each office be codified to provide us the reports that are needed when an investigation is over. We've also heard many complaints that come through, but they do not come in front of the board at any time So that's something to consider of how that process or policy can be put forward, because right now, little or no action is being done when there are complaints because they either go into HR or legal, but never come in front of the board. And there's no such language that they have to come to the board. We also want to acknowledge that current policies and procedures need to be updated as they do not reflect that we have an Inspector General's office. What I noticed in March that we had a device, I guess there's a document about device seizure, that there is a chain of command. And I had asked in March what happens if part of that chain of command is part of the investigation. Since then, still that policy has not been updated. We also want to make sure that the language does not hinder any investigations, not allowing whistleblowers the ability to have safe to come forward to give accused persons the opportunity to destroy devices. Anything that will require either the ethics office or the inspector general to have the governing board be part of the initiating investigations or requiring offices to give parties advance notice investigations, or any legislation that puts limitations on either office's ability to conduct investigations, such as requiring either office to make open records requests or not allowing immediate access, puts that in jeopardy. You would not want to be a whistleblower knowing that your information could be leaked out there. And the language regarding the makeup of the board, and I had presented this in my presentation, that nominations should not be limited by professions except for the two legal organizations that keeps us from having limited members. And the chairperson should be chosen by the actual board who they see fit to lead the board.
Time.
Okay, thank you very much. Our next speaker.
Next up, we have J. Wesley Day.
Good afternoon. My name is J. Wesley Day, and I am here standing alone. I'm not representing any organization or anyone. I'm here to advocate that you keep the Office of Inspector General intact and in place with full power to investigate employees and the processes and procedures of the city of Atlanta. There needs to be a checks and balance. I'm also here to share part of my personal story, asking for investigation into the LGBTQ department. As a gay man, I was beaten into a coma in 2018. I've left everyone my report, hopefully you received it. And I have asked continuously for support from the LGBTQ department, directly from Malik Brown, and there's been no sort of support. As a gay man, I would think that they would be there for me. I took my concerns to the Constituent Services Department. I ask you officially today to investigate the Constituent Service Department. They have yet to provide me with any type of services. As a result of this crime, I, who was beaten and captured my assailants on video, I was charged with a felony. How does that make sense? I lost my job at Delta Airlines. I went homeless. And the city of Atlanta, and through the departments that's supposed to provide me with some type of support, have done nothing. This is why the Office of Inspector General is needed to investigate matters such as this, to understand what have you done, why didn't you do anything as a civically engaged person in the city of Atlanta. I thank you for your time, your support, and if someone can tell me what I would need to do next to file an official complaint for those two departments to be under investigation. And once again, my hat's off to the current members that's holding the Office of Inspector General down. Thank you for your hard work and support.
Thank you.
Next up, we have Mr. Jim Martin.
Yes, Jim Martin, 764 Humber Street, Chair Member Planning Unit D. I was here at your last two meetings and heard the testimony at your last meeting. I think it's important for this board to keep in mind what it did not hear in that testimony. I heard nothing to indicate that the actions of the Office of Inspector General are in any way out of line with other offices of Inspector General. And if they are in fact consistent with standards, then I see no reason why they should be drawn into question. I heard it implied that personal electronic devices had been confiscated, but I did not hear any firsthand testimony that this had occurred. If it has never occurred, then it does not belong in the record of these hearings. I heard it implied that people had been questioned outside of their workplaces and outside of working hours. I did not hear any firsthand testimony that had ever occurred, and it does not, because this is in the record of this body. I heard it implied that people had been harmed unjustly by any OIG investigation. There may be those who feel slighted, but I have seen no evidence of any harm. And once again, if that has never occurred, then it does not need to be a record of the hearings of this body. Thank you.
Thank you.
Next up, we have Rhonda Frost.
Hello, my name is Rhonda Frost. I'm the former Deputy Director of Public Affairs for the Atlanta Police Department. Before attending these hearings, I had no idea City of Atlanta employees had rights during investigations. I was a City of Atlanta employee. My career and my professional reputation were stolen because of unlawful investigation and retaliatory actions by Darren Shearbaum, Shada Spikes, Peter Amon, and people in your HR department. You say you have concerns about OIG's investigations, notifications for employees, city equipment being confiscated, and procedural violations during investigations. I find that interesting. My daughter Shanae posted a video on social media challenging APD's homicide charges against Shaka Zulu. That video went viral and my work life became hell. On November 30th, 2022, I was ordered out of my office and physically locked out of the building without notice. I was then investigated for 7 months without due process. I was never interviewed and never allowed to respond to the allegations. On April 27, 2023, I emailed Mayor Dickens and his team asking for help, sharing full details. They did nothing. On May 15, 2023, HR Director Patrick Pendleton concluded his investigation of me. In the report, he advised the HR Commissioner and all parties that I should be put back in my job, as I had not violated any rules, policies, or SOPs. I was not notified of this investigation update. I remained home under investigation for 5 more months. On July 10, 2023, an APD sergeant and HR director came to my home unannounced and confiscated my ID, work phone, and laptop. They told me I no longer work for APD. They told me instead I work for the City of Atlanta in an unnamed role. On September 10th, I was fired under the guise of reduction in force, even though APD had already hired someone in my job. These actions violated city policy, SOP, and federal laws, but clearly these violations are okay with all of you and the mayor. Either you care about integrity and rule of law in all investigations, or you don't. This must be some sort of political game. Thank you.
Thank you.
That concludes public comment.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. All right, our charge per the resolution that created this task force is to review the processes and procedures of the Office of the Inspector General, the Ethics Officer, and the Governing Board of the Office of the Inspector General and the Ethics Office, and make recommendations, written recommendations to the Mayor and to the Atlanta City Council concerning the issues described in the recitals of those resolutions. The legislation is specific and includes the following observations and requests for our citizens to do the following. Number 1, provide clarity concerning matters related to the authority, duties, and responsibilities of the Office of the Inspector General, including the OIG and the ethics officers' respective reporting relationships to the Governing Board of the Office of the Inspector General and Ethics Officer. Number 2, define the rights and responsibilities of employees concerning interactions with the Office of the Inspector General and the Ethics Officer. Number 3, define the processes and procedures to ensure access to records and other evidence. And number 4, examine the procedures concerning investigations conducted by the Office of the Inspector General and the Ethics Office, including the criteria for the initiation thereof, while ensuring that both offices have the tools and the independence necessary to carry out their respective duties and responsibilities while still maintaining accountability to their board. Now, for us to complete our charge within the time parameters given by the City Council, we need to stay focused on the areas that they requested our advice and recommendations on. We have received a lot of information, especially at the last meeting, and in writing, about the task on which we have to opine, as well as more than that. And in my view, we know that there are issues that probably need to be addressed and cleared. To that end, I propose that we discuss the task among us that we were assigned by the City Council one at a time to make it easier for everyone to digest and for us to be able to take notes on. Because we do have a fairly hard stop around 5:30, I'm going to ask that we take the 4 sections to discuss them in about 20 minutes apiece, not 5 minutes apiece, but 20 minutes apiece to ensure that we get through all of them in a timely fashion, give or take. Okay, ask the clerk to try to keep us, let me know about how the time is going, because I mean, we could stay here all night if we had to. So let's start with number 1. I'm just going to throw them out, and I want to hear from my fellow task force members, and I'll chime in as needed. Number 1, does anyone have any comments or observations or thoughts about issues associated with the authority, duties, and responsibilities of the respective officers and their reporting relationship to the governing board? And I'll repeat, does anyone have any comments or observations or thoughts about issues associated with the authority, duties, and responsibility of the respective officers and their reporting relationship to the governing board? And I'll just kick it off, just to get started. It seemed from what we heard at the last meeting that the ethics officer has an understanding that she reports to the governing board. But I'm not sure that it's clear that the OIG legislation has that in it, or there's an understanding of that. Did I get that right or wrong? What are your thoughts on
I think that's right.
it? Okay.
I think that's right. That seems to be an issue, that there's not a shall report, to the boards. It's like there's direct kind of oversight and reporting responsibility in the OIG to the board.
Is there one? Should there be one? I'm just doing the Supreme Court, kicking it around. Okay, since that's what I got.
We think so. I mean, I'm not sure how many shepherds board deals with
Yeah.
responsibility.
We can hear it a little loud.
I said, I think so, because I don't see.
Turn it on.
Talking about-
Let me just say this in advance. We're not the city council. It's you're all lawyers. It's odd. I was on the Supreme Court for many, many years, and it's odd for me anyway to be deliberating in public. Okay, so turning on mics and all that kind of stuff seems odd. Okay, normally you hear the case and go back, but that's our process here. This is a legislative process. It's so please, as we bumble around, be nice. We're trying to make it happen. Okay, all right. So yeah.
I don't see how there could be oversight if there's not clear responsibility of reporting it to the governing board.
Ms. Miller, you're right. I don't know what that.
turned it on.
Yeah, okay. I don't know what that means, but just,
Well,
that's,
I'll simply offer that I agree with what Norm said. Inherent with a board is the authority to oversee the operation of whatever the entity is that they're responsible for. And so while there may not be a lot of specification in enabling legislation, I think if you were to look at the comparable state law that would govern board functions, I think you would find some support there through the motion that one just raised. The board is responsible for ensuring the independence of the Inspector General. I think that in itself requires some level of reporting to the board in order to assure that that is taking place, that they have to satisfy themselves that the Inspector General is operating in a setting in which, in their view, and in their judgment, it is independent. And they're responsible for that, and they need to see to that. And they can't do that if they're not, one, provided certain levels of information, not all. I would certainly agree with that. Not all information just comes to the board. But they need to be knowledgeable enough to see to it that their overarching responsibility is being taken.
Anyone else?
Yeah, I'll just add that, agreeing with the other comments that have been made, two of the salient concerns that were drawn out in the last two meetings was whether a responsibility to the board would promote the independence of the Inspector General. Given the way that, at least I understand, the board to be composed and how it's appointed, I don't necessarily see that there's any independence that's eroded through having that particular board having oversight of the office. The other concern that I think we heard, I believe it was at the last meeting, was that one of the persons providing comment suggested that if the board were to oversee the office, particularly as it relates to sensitive investigations, that would be done in a public forum and therefore would cause issues around the confidentiality of investigations. But to Mr. Dean's point, the manner in which that is generally handled, at least in my experience, in state government, is that is done during the executive session, and it's done in a limited way to ensure that the confidentiality of certain sensitive information is not disclosed and still protects the confidentiality of the investigation moving forward. And I do think that there is a way to balance the interests, both of oversight as well as of having the oversight of the board as well as the independence of the investigation that can be better than that.
I tend to agree with that for the most part. One of the concerns that was raised by the ethics officer was that the governing board, as it's constituted right now, that they need their own governing board, because when you're in the ethics lane, there is more of a adjudication process that occurs with the board as opposed to with the OIG. There's more of an oversight. I think those are really two different functions. And so I think that the possibility of having separate boards for both the ethics office and the OIG is worth exploring. I think it would clarify things like subpoenas, motions to quash, and other more judicial adjudicative things as opposed to a purely sort of oversight function for whatever that's worth. And as much as, the role of the Inspector General is really specific. It's really a unique sort of arm of government, no matter where it is. And considerations which should be given, perhaps, if a new board structure was appropriate to the types of individuals who have a kind of investigatory oversight, experience, not exclusively, obviously, but in some respects, so that the board is able to do appropriate their oversight over Inspector General.
So I think I'm hearing that you're suggesting that we go back to the old system of the ethics office reports to an ethics board. Okay, OIG stays with whatever, however you do, a separate board. Okay, governing the OIG, but that the OIG board had more prosecutorial kind of expertise kind of.
Yeah, I think just having experience in what the unique role of an OIG is supposed to be,
Right.
and also understanding how investigations go, will give the kind of oversight that I think would be appropriate, both for the OIG explaining what she's trying to do to folks who understand that, and vice versa. Folks who are doing oversight can have a clear sort of understanding of what it is that the OIG is trying to accomplish.
Any other comments? Councilman Fisher?
The other, again, I think would fall to this category, to its scope. It struck me that it wasn't clear that there was a well-defined scope of responsibility for the OIG's investigation. And I just, wonder if clarifying the scope would include major fraud, waste, and abuse as compared to other extraneous factors. I think we heard some testimony that there are lots of issues that come in and many of them that they refer, but it didn't seem to me that it was clearly defined that their scope would be major fraud, waste, and abuse, which might also be helpful. There was some indication that there are concerns that some of the investigations may not be, or maybe outside that kind of scope, and may not be appropriate for the OIG.
Like blurred lines.
Yes.
The lines are too blurred. But clarify the lines there. Who has what responsibility? HR, Ethics Office, OIG. Be there. Okay. Any other comments on that discrete section?
Well, I would just say it might be helpful, if, the governing, whatever, whether it is as it is, whatever council decides, as it relates to the governing board, and if there are any changes to be made, that their role be clearly defined as well. You know what I mean? So that they understand what oversight means, because oversight can mean a lot of different things. And so I think ultimately the role of the board's oversight, and there are plenty of examples out there in cities where not as many OIGs report to boards as they do separately, they have a different, but to the extent that there are jurisdictions that utilize boards as the oversight mechanism, it might help the city well to understand what that oversight looks like in places where the OIG is sort of working as it should.
Okay. For those boards for those OIGs that report to boards, we should probably take a look at some of the other jurisdictions that have board chambers. Okay.
There's one other thing I think fits in this category is peer review. It's not clear that there's any obligation for peer review to occur on a regular basis. And I think that would be very valuable for the Office of OIG and for the governing board to sort of have a check once in a while about sort of where they stand against best practices. They provide opportunity for them to have a lens through which they can consider, how to focus their, oversight. So I think that's something that could be formalized that would be also helpful.
Look, if we got a functioning OIG board, wouldn't the board be able to come up with a lot of, because you would think that would be the first step, at least get some processes and procedures in place, which we don't have.
But the nature of the OIG's work is such that unless you have board members with very specific background, they're not going to know how to
do that.
structure and see to it that an investigation is part. They can recognize when it's properly concluded, because you can ask enough questions to understand it, but you won't have the ability to organize it from the front to then methodically get to a conclusion. So I think Nora's point is a very good one. When we were able to look at the Jefferson Parish in New Orleans, and I was really struck by how complete their policies and procedures are. And one of the things they do is every 3 years they have the peer review that you're talking about. I think it needs to be more regular than that, because the board should be able to function to see to it that the ordinary operations are taking place between those cycles, but then on some kind of schedule. There needs to be some very knowledgeable peer organization that's looking at the operations to say, you're meeting these standards or you're not.
And is this a good place to talk about, once the processes and procedures are in place, they should be published somewhere or outward facing, so everybody knows what they are, which I don't think they are now.
You know,
I may be wrong.
I think this is one of the major deficiencies at this point, and I'm not blaming them necessarily, but that's an observation that I think we all would agree with, that there's no organized, public-facing information telling employees or the public itself what you should expect from the IG's office when it comes to interfacing. There doesn't seem to be any kind of documentation that tells, say, an employee that this is how we go about conducting a review. This is how we conduct interviews. This is where we presumptively have an interview take place, or any of those kinds of things that are public-facing. And then there needs to be internal policies and procedures that don't get shared with the public as to how to go about the process of actually conducting an investigation. Whether you tell somebody that they are subject to an investigation, those kinds of things, that's probably internal. Because you wouldn't want to do that on every interview. And in addition, you won't know it for every interview.
Any
5 minutes remaining.
Double duty saying. Any more on this section? We have 3 others to cover.
No, I think just lastly, I would say I agree with Rick, that I do think, you know, one of the keys towards transparency, and this is all about more transparency, is that there is not a ton of transparency around the operations of the OIG, not the investigation, not specific cases. Obviously, that is not for public consumption, but I do think having some public-facing document, much like the Atlanta Police Department publishes their SOPs on their website, so that people can understand sort of what the procedures are with respect to OIG. And then if there are any general policy statements that are appropriate to publish, different jurisdictions do it differently. I think that might be a good way to sort of help our city transition into this new world of having an OIG, because as Rick and I found when we were talking to the Association of Inspectors General, there is this sort of bumpy phase that cities go through when an OIG is introduced into the ecosystem, and it's mostly because people are just not used to it.
Thank you. I've just been informed that people are having difficulty hearing us because we're not speaking into the mic. So please speak into the mic. Okay. Just pull up your chair. We're sorry. We're working. Public audience. So Representative Miller, you want to say that again?
Did y'all didn't hear what I just said? Oh my goodness, I'm so sorry.
She said it so well.
Let me turn it this way. So I was echoing Rick's point that I think it would be helpful to have some sort of outward-facing document or on the website the policies and procedures of the OIG, much like APD does, so that there is some sense of transparency even with the OIG's office. Now, that does not mean that the OIG's investigations or sensitive information about cases is for public consumption. But I do think, based on conversations that we had with the Association of Inspectors General, that a lot of times when OIGs are introduced into an ecosystem that's not accustomed to the way that they work, it's just a lot of confusion about, you know, someone who has the ability to go into every office anytime they want. People might not understand how that works. They might not understand that the true nature of what an OIG does. So I think if there is something public that gives the public some sense of how the OIG governs him or herself without compromising the integrity of the office, I think that might go a good way to sort of transitioning us into having an OIG as part of the ecosystem here in Atlanta.
Thank you. Thank you. All right, I'm gonna move on to the second issue. Does anyone have any comments, observations, or thoughts about issues associated with the rights of employees when interacting with the OIG and the ethics officer? Are there any concerns? I, for one, have a concern about a union rep not being able to be present if someone's a member of a union, or an attorney if that is in fact the case.
Right, I think, yes, I think, I agree with you, Justice Sears. One of the things that we looked at the time, that we had, permitted was, for example, how Chicago, and the president of AIG, the Associations of Inspector Generals, who, was for a long time the IG for Chicago Public Schools. And of course, Chicago has a very strong union presence. And so the way that they drafted their, they just had a lot more protections in mind as it related to employees, and were just really clear with employees that they had the ability to have an attorney present or union representation present for those interviews. So I think that that is a good thing to have, and I think some clarity needs to be established throughout the city on this issue. You know, how they view an employee's refusal to cooperate, for example, because it does seem to be that there might be some conflicting things where the OIG may say, hey, your job's not on the line if you don't want to talk to us, but the city may say something different. And so I think just clarifying what the city's policy is on that would be helpful to employees.
Would you think that the employee who is not the subject of an investigation could use the lawyer from the city of Atlanta? From the city of Atlanta, or no? What do we do?
Me?
Well, I think probably not.
Okay.
Yeah, well, I hope you can hear me. I think probably not, because as you heard the young lady testify, to tell us that she had an incident with the IG's office in which she requested that the city attorney office provide her a lawyer to go to the meeting with the IG.
Right.
Well, you don't have to be a lawyer yourself to understand that the lawyer for the city has a responsibility to represent the IG's office the same as that lawyer would to represent the interest of that individual insofar as it related to the city.
So it's a conflict.
So it's an obvious conflict. And
But I'm saying it seems like it would be okay though for the city to provide or pay for that representation. I think they put the employee in an awkward position to have to pay for it themselves. So I think that being able to sort of make it clear that that would be appropriate for the city, they will make a lawyer available if you had that conflict situation or if there was a concern.
A statement of outside counsel. Okay. Who could be made available? Okay. Anything else on that issue? Or any issue under that, employee rights? Yes, Councilman.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry I'm late. It's just adjourned a few minutes ago. So one of the questions I've been turning over in my mind is, let's say you're a city employee, you're working at home, you get a knock at the door, it's an IT investigator. I think we need to be very clear about what's going on. It's the employee's responsibility to understand what their rights are, or if the person knocking on the door has the obligation to say X, Y, Z at the very outset. I mean, there's going to be a lot of education involved here if we're supposed to let 500 people know it's a revolving door, there's new people coming and going all the time. So I think there needs to be some kind of boilerplate.
Form?
Yeah, that's transmitted.
Okay.
well, that gets back in part to one of the points that I think we've all made, that there needs to be some public-facing information made available for for employees as well as the public generally to understand how the Inspector General presumes to operate. If you were to look at the procedures in Jefferson Parish, they specify that interviews are to occur between the hours of 8 and 4. It specifies that they are to occur at the person's place of work, usual place of work, or by agreement someplace else. So there are various ways in which this issue can be addressed, and a lot of it has to be as my colleague has said more consistently than I, and that is publicly providing information, being transparent about how the office intends to operate. You're not limiting the office. You're still able to do the interviews, and you simply tell people, here's how we, in the ordinary course, here's how we're going to operate.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. I think even in the onboarding process, the city should consider whether or not employees are onboarded with an understanding of, what the OIG does, what the ethics office does, and the like. I think there were questions about seizing city-issued computers or city-issued cell phones. Look, I think that is an appropriate function of the OIG. Now the process by which the OIG follows to do that may need to be clarified. But I do think that when you look at OIG offices, they are consistently permitted to access things that are city property. When it comes to personal cell phones or laptops, whether that occurred or did not occur, that is completely different and completely inappropriate, I would say. And secondly, I would just offer as a thought in moving forward, approaching going to someone's home with great care. Because unless you have post-certified police officers with you, police officers are very careful about going to someone's home and knocking on their door unannounced. This is Georgia, and we've all seen these very tragic instances in the news where someone is on someone's porch, someone says, hey, I was afraid for my life, and then something awful happens. So I think the practice, even as it relates to folks who have elected to work at home, really needs to be very carefully drafted for the safety of city employees who might be showing up at someone's home unannounced, as well as for the respect and the sanctity of someone's home, which is a well-recognized in all of our jurisprudence, a very special place in our Constitution for the person's home. So I would offer that.
Right, and if someone is working from home, they'd be asked to come to their office.
I think that's safer.
Or do they get to OIG's office or to a conference room?
Or to agree to meet at their
Agree
home,
to-
if that's what they
Yes.
need to do.
Right. So any other comments in that generally? And I'm going to move on to the third idea. Does anyone have any comments, observations, or thoughts about issues associated with what processes or procedures we could suggest to address the access to records and other sources of evidence, which I think includes city and personal phones and equipment? I think you just hit on that. I guess the first thing I would add to that is, though, when seeking to get even a city property, I would make a request, ask that it be submitted voluntarily, a kind, gentle request. And then, I don't know if that's happening or not, I don't know. But I looked at a couple of jurisdictions and that was like number one, request that it be surrendered voluntarily. Okay.
Yeah, I think that, and I know that different jurisdictions do it differently, but I think there's a way for the most part to remotely access like an employee's computer without having to seize the computer unless there's some specific reason why seizure is appropriate. Perhaps there can be and I don't know if this exists, but perhaps there can be a similar way to get access to an employee's cell phone, if it's a city-issued cell phone, without the necessity of seizing it. But the necessity of seizing it might be a thing. There may be things that are actually on the device that, whoever's investigating, waste or corruption or fraud, they need access to that information, and they want to get it before it's destroyed. So, one, I think city employees need to be warned that they have absolutely no privacy interest. I'm sure they are, but it needs to be really clear. They have no privacy interest in their city computers or their city phones. And then I think a process, whether it is request surrendering, although I do think that is something that can be explored by council, or a mechanism by which a person is directed to bring their cell phone to a certain location, or I'm not sure how the ethics office does it if they do that, but what I don't think is a good idea is showing up at someone's home because they work from home and they have a city cell phone there to come and seize the cell phone. I just think that is unusual and dangerous.
Anyone else? And what about personal cell phones and devices, but they might have city business on? No.
Well, when you start to get into the area of personal
Right.
equipment like that, I think you're in an area where you really gotta go to law enforcement, go through the
I just
court.
wanted to hear that.
You gotta go to the court system because our Constitution protects those issues. And certainly an IG's office ought to have a concern that they're acting consistent with constitutional requirements.
So we're in subpoena here.
You can subpoena it, and then, but you might just need to get a search warrant to actually get it. And then if you were to have to go into the court system, then there are normal rules that would apply to protect people in that situation. But to get back to a point that we were making earlier, the enabling legislation says that all city employees are required to cooperate with the IG's office and to provide city-owned equipment if it's requested. And I don't know to what extent that messaging takes place in terms of making sure that people actually understand it. I think Representative Miller's point that putting an IT office into an ecosystem that is very well established and long standing, and then expecting it to operate without there being some bumps along the road, it's just not realistic. And we're dealing with the bumps along the road. But there are ways that can be done. It has been done very successfully in a number of places. And I think the city would do well, and the IG would do well, to look to those places where there has been a very successful IG's office that has gone about the public service.
But to that end, just referencing some of the practical considerations that come up with recommendations from other members, at least in the state government context, particularly on a state-issued laptop, or even at times on a state-issued phone, there's a warning that pops up every time you power that device on. So if this is a piece of public property, any action that you take on this device is, it's essentially, it's a red screen, and it's a warning that it is a public device. Going more towards the direction of training, obviously, there's a big hill to climb in terms of establishing a baseline of understanding of new offices, particularly ones with investigative powers like the Inspector General. And to that end, at least in state government, the practice has been for the last several years to provide quarterly training for the HR or legal offices of the different divisions of state government to educate state employees on everything from document retention, open meetings requirements, the roles of the state inspector general, rights as employees, these sorts of things. And those meetings take an hour, 2 hours per quarter, but at least in terms of establishing that baseline and building towards a culture within the organization that understands and appreciates roles, that's something that was pretty broadly successful there.
Any more comments?
Justice Susan, the last comment I would offer is that just as we've talked about the fact that the IG has, I believe, a responsibility to have public facing and to make clear what to expect from that office. I think likewise, the city has a responsibility because if the IG is issuing a request for information of whatever sort, you've already got enabling legislation which tells all City of Atlanta employees that they have to cooperate. And if the city's not taking active step to see to it that messaging is out there, then I think they're inviting tension and conflict, because the likelihood is that a city employee who receives a request will treat it as an open record request, that something that they're more accustomed to. And the IG's authority is different than that. And the city has already made a judgment that if the IG asks for information, you will give it to them, related to public property. You will give it to them. And so the city, it's incumbent upon the city to make sure that if that's a part of your legislation, that employees have to understand, that is that they are to take these requests seriously and to address them in a serious fashion.
And that is part of the enabling legislation
Yes.
already, so.
You know, I still think this council gets to the point about making sure that the scope is properly defined. Because I think we did hear a little bit of concern about maybe overly broad requests for information relative to, you know, what's being investigated. So there needs to be, I think, some clarity around scope. Then also, I think, some cooperation in making sure that sort of the requests are sort of narrowly focused enough to be able to get at the information that's reasonably necessary for the investigation, and not so broad as to be disruptive and sort of a fishing expedition. So that I think, you know, that's also a key part of cooperation. And I think well-functioning sort of organizations probably have that kind of a relationship between, say, the legal department and the OIG. But again, I think scope is key, so that you don't feel like they can go and sort of ask for a really broad request for information for just sort of any matter that comes up.
So how do you keep it from becoming a fishing expedition?
Well, it's incumbent upon the people in the offices to operate with some level of goodwill toward one another. I mean, they're both working for the city.
Right.
They should be able to, if you've got a person who's well-intentioned and supportive of the notion that I'm going to act in the best interest of the city,
Right.
the employee to whom I'm reaching out, they should have that same presumption about what they're doing. And they ought to be able to find a way to address the issues that Norm just mentioned. You can't ask for every terabyte of information that somebody might have on their computer. That's ridiculous, and it just occupies their time and it prevents them from going about their ordinary duties. So there ought to be goodwill enough that you can resolve these things in a fashion that you can get what you need to do your job without disrupting.
And just what you need, not everything.
That's right.
And it does seem if you had a more direct reporting into the oversight board, if there were, you know, disputes, and you had the right sort of qualified individuals on that board, that the board could also maybe, you know, work as a, you know, as a governor kind of on that process as well.
But I think I would say this, I think that as the city moves forward and wrestles with this, because they will have to wrestle with it, I think, but there are resources out there that will help them. The independence of the OG, I keep wanting to say the OG, original gangster, no, I'm kidding. The IG is crucial to the role. So if you don't have an independent IG that functions independently, then you don't really have an IG, right? So if the legislation as enacted gives the IG a tremendous amount of authority. And to some extent, you can clarify a little bit some of the places that are blurry. You can educate more to get people to understand what this role means. But the essence of that role is some degree of independence.
Right.
And so I think that has to be part of the consideration as the city moves forward and sort of tries to grapple with things like scope. What does that mean? It's a pretty broad mandate. Fraud, waste, corruption, the other one's abuse.
But I would say major.
Major, I mean, that might be, but then you have to define major, right? So this is, like, part of this is, we can't over legislate this role. It's you do want to put guardrails up, but you in some respects, you gotta trust the IG that you hire. And once you hire that IG, you gotta let him or her do their job. So guardrails are one thing, but staying mindful of the true role of what an IG is, and it's a fascinating, really sort of unique kind of investigatory position. So it may do folks some good just to get a real clear understanding of how IG offices function in other jurisdictions that are similarly situated.
All right, thank you. We're gonna go on to the next one. Any ideas, comments, or observations on the processes for investigations and how they are handled, and what is the role of the governing board? We've discussed a lot of this, but on the processes for investigation and how they are handled, and what is the role of the government? Have we already going to talk this out?
There's one thing that, just serious that I want to mention related to that. We heard, comments from members of the public as well as employees of the city of Atlanta that were, subject to investigations, by the IG office. And I think what was unique and stood out to me, particularly from the last meeting, is looking at the ethics officer and how those matters are resolved. There's a very clear kind of rubric for how the ethics office resolves cases. It was unclear to me whether there is a similar kind of clear rubric for how the IG's office resolves cases. And I do think that matters to the extent, we heard from a couple of city employees in particular, that were very concerned about how they had been implicated in an investigation. There was, through the process of that investigation, perhaps they received some sort of stigma from how they were treated through that investigation. And ultimately, maybe their names were cleared for those investigations. And that's important because, at least in the public context, right, you have, I do believe that it's a special calling when people want to participate in public service, right? And you don't want to discourage that. And I do believe it's very important that there be specific parameters placed around the policies of how the investigations are carried out, not to limit the IG in the ability to carry out an investigation, but to ensure that if it is a witness to something, that person is protected reputationally within the workplace as that investigation unfolds, to the extent that they would be, have to bear some sort of stigma for that. And one of the ways that we accomplish that at the state level in particular investigations was essentially creating a framework of resolutions, right? There was, if a complaint came in on a particular state employee, then there would be an investigation that occurs, and then at the conclusion of that, there would essentially be 4 categories in which the results of that investigation could be finalized, and that's either a confidential dismissal that there's no wrongdoing, to the extent that the investigation remained confidential, that there's insufficient evidence to support standard, that there is essentially a referral mechanism for further investigation from some other office that has the requisite investigatory powers to look into something. And then finally, at least in the context of what we're talking about here with the Office of Inspector General, there could be a 4th category of, yes, this was clearly a violation, and then whether that needs to be referred or what have you. But that at least takes into account the fact that the City of Atlanta employees are coming to work every day. They're going back to the previous point that there needs to be, a culture of mutual understanding, a culture of trust that everyone's here to advance the best interest of the city. And that helps ensure that it's not, at least from what we've heard in terms of public comment, that there's not a situation where someone is intimidated to engage with the Office of Inspector General purely because of how they have seen others treated throughout that investigation process.
Good comments. Ben, please.
I would say on that point, one of the things that I found interesting in talking to the president of the Association of Inspectors General is that they were very careful about putting names of individuals in reports that were going to be publicly released, that they would often redact names of folks who aren't sort of the main event. And prior to releasing that report to the public, there was a mechanism for review of that report through that particular chain before it was released. The IG itself, as I understand it, although we can double Mr. Fletcher, we can double back with him, but I don't think he sua sponte issued, publicized his reports. He viewed his reports as fact-finding. He viewed his reports as a mechanism to make recommendations. He then gave those recommendations to the appropriate people, and then the appropriate people, there was just a process, and I don't want to keep quoting on it.
The appropriate, can you remember who the appropriate people were in his instance? The governing board or?
No, they were typically department heads at the city.
Oh, I see, okay.
People, I think you characterize it as people who had the authority to address the underlying issue.
Understood, okay.
And it also ultimately, I think, went to the board, the school board, the elected folks who are sort of responsible with it. But that's Chicago. They don't have a governing board, right? So that's a different structure. For Jefferson Parish, that does have a governing board, the AIG's director of sort of government affairs or government outreach was an OIG in Jefferson Parish. And he offered it, he actually submitted his SOPs to us for review. He offered that the way that he approached his findings was this, that he would, before he released anything, present his findings to the governing board. He would give the governing board the opportunity for feedback, to ask questions, sometimes based on that interaction. He would go and do additional things. He would also give the executive sort of branch a first look, a heads up about what his investigation revealed and what his recommendations were. He would give everybody the opportunity to know and prepare for the report to eventually become public. I do think that he had the ability in the way he drafted his to make public reports, but within his protocols, there were things that he followed such that you have to, I think, balance sort of what you ultimately want about the OIG, and that is for the OIG to certainly root out waste, fraud, corruption, and abuse without question. With sort of, collateral damage, whether that's to witnesses, whether that's to someone who was initially suspected, but they're, eventually exonerated, that, this person isn't now living with, a stigma that impacts their livelihood, their life, their reputation that they've worked, 40 or 50 years to attain. And I think it's possible, right? You can do both. And so these are the sort of things that I think the city will have to grapple with. They will have to find the practices that work best for the city. Keeping in mind that you have to let an OIG do what an OIG is supposed to do.
There was one other thing that bothered me that I think is part of the best practices that I read at the AIG, which is at some point making it clear that the target of the investigation or the subject, however you want to describe it, gets an opportunity to have notice about what the allegation is, and then an opportunity to respond in some way in writing or interview, so that it's clear that there's some opportunity to directly address the allegation. And I did not get the sense that that was part of the protocols that were followed, here. And I think that's an important thing to be incorporated into any policies, procedures, or recommendations, so that there's no doubt about notice to the person who has targeted an opportunity to
Well, I
respond.
didn't see that either. Nor really did I see an appeal like, for the subject of the investigation. Where do you appeal if you don't agree with what was found? Where's your, right? It says serve to some court.
Well, then again, I think you gotta really clarify what your OIG does. Is your OIG a report and recommender, or is your OIG a person who actually levies some sort of punishment or decision that you have to live with, right? So if your OIG is just giving it a report and recommendation, as I understand it, the city has a mechanism for employees who are terminated to go through that sort of due process, right? Because what we're concerned about is due process. So as long as those, and I would say, just make it super clear, make it super clear in whatever the policy is, or if you tweak the legislation, what the OIG does at the end of her investigation. Is she recommending, or is she sanctioning? And then if she is sanctioning, what is the process that the employee has?
That's a good point, because my understanding is the OIG in Atlanta recommends, the ethics officer sanctions. It's different.
I think that is how it's in practice, but I think some clarity around that.
Definitely, and it's confusing, yes.
And that is actually what I was going to get at. I do believe that if the intention, again, was only for the OIG to recommend the ethics officer to sanction, and so much so that we did go through the process of removing the ethics out of OIG, because there was a clear problem for sure. So in its work in the beginning, of course, we didn't know how everything was going to flow. And we did look at models throughout other municipalities, and only chose a little bit from different ones, which I do know now that, that's why we're here. That's why we have this task force now. From what I hear, though, great observations of where we could shore up the legislation. I did miss a portion, because I had a meeting after FEC.
We were watching.
Okay. And as soon as we finished, I had to go to my office. Someone was waiting over there. So I got here as soon as I could. But I did miss the portion that spoke about the rights of employees, because that's the part that I just wanted to shore up. And I think I kind of hear that we're wavering now or deciding whether it should be in-house or not. I would say that our law department is dual report to elected officers.
So we've already.
So I'm thinking that, no.
No, we
Right.
said, but Norm here made a good point about maybe getting the subject from an outside one, but not a single.
Okay,
That would be a comment.
okay. So then, a recommendation would certainly be necessary, from this task force to.
On that.
On that, for sure. That's one thing I definitely didn't wanna forget to speak about today. I think that is extremely important. And then there's gotta be a little education around making sure that the employees, know that. Because what I do wanna do, for sure, is make sure that the OIG, does feel 100%. That's why we have, and I definitely don't wanna take away, that. I really do. At the same time, I want our employees to feel protected as they do as regular citizens. Everyone should understand well that at the end of the day, as citizens, we deserve representation. If we are asked certain questions that could really have a different, could impact our lives. So that recommendation, I would want to make sure for sure that we get written. Also, like the idea around what you were talking about,
Representative,
I'm sorry.
Representative Miller.
Oh, yeah, Representative Miller, but I was trying to think of exactly what you said, and I pulled my pen up and write it down, and it went away. But it'll come back. But this was around when you were having a conversation, but it'll come back. But as soon as it does, I'm gonna ring my bell so that, because this was another recommendation that was important to me for. I know.
I do want to say one thing that Councilman Overstreet just reminded me of. So there was a mechanism for the IG to issue a subpoena. There is also in the legislation a mechanism for a person to quash the subpoena. But there is not necessarily a notification provision about the issuance of a subpoena. So it almost feels like the city has given a power to use the administrative subpoena, given a responsibility, a power of a person to contest it, but there is a gap between sort of, when the person gets the subpoena themselves, then obviously they know they got an administrative subpoena. If the administrative subpoena is issued to someone else, and it is for that person, if that person has standing to contest it or move to quash it and they don't have notice of it. So I would say one of the things I really want the city to focus on and flesh out in terms of procedurally how the issuance of subpoenas work, right? Because you can't just, you can't have a willy-nilly subpoena process, but the EIG does have to have the ability to get at records and documents that aren't readily accessible and available.
Yeah, so the issue of the silent subpoena, right? So that if you don't have notice of it, then how could you possibly contest it? That's a great skill.
Council.
As soon as Representative Miller started speaking, it came back to me. I want to make sure we also include a recommendation around publicizing what we are and what OIG is investigating. As you spoke about with the president of, what'd you say, AIG? I think that it's important that we do that because if we think about it, these are recommendations and they're not the actual sanctions or penalties or whatever goes with that. And I don't know if we should be publicizing recommendations that beforehand, like before it is all final and there's sanctions there or there's something that happens.
Other than a recommendation.
Or even if it's just an acceptance of a recommendation. I think that is a good time for a publication. Do you know what I mean? I think that's fair as well. I don't mind saying that we have to investigate something, but only if it is warranted because something was agreed upon or found to be wasteful, corruptly, or neglect, or, And it's not clear. That is in the legislation, that is not clear. And I think that's another place where we could actually have a better choice of legislation.
So to tag on to that particular point, thinking about the role of an IG within a government organization, as we've discussed a lot, it's not necessarily the final stop in the process of a case or an investigation against an employee. And I think utilizing the existing off-ramps and the systems that we have for that, we talk a lot about the fact the IG is intended to investigate fraud, waste, and abuse. And a lot of times, and I think we've heard this through the public comment, is that sometimes it's not fraud, waste, or abuse, it's an HR issue that can be addressed by a manager. The off-ramp for that should be to the appropriate HR department for that employee and then they can take it from there, right? It's not a public referral. On the flip side, if it's fraud, waste, or abuse of criminal nature, then the off-ramp is a referral into a prosecutor's office, where then that investigation becomes essentially the seed of a broader investigation by a law enforcement agency. And then that essentially minnows the procedural language that I think the city then has to address in terms of how do you handle investigations that result in something in the middle. And that's maybe a much more targeted way to think about how to address the resolutions of these investigations as opposed to having to build bridges to other locations, if that makes sense.
1 minute remaining discussion.
Okay, thank you. Any further discussion? All right. Well, I want to thank each member of the task force for their comments and participation in this discussion, and for synthesizing what you think needs to happen. We're going to work in smaller teams now. This is our last public meeting, but we'll work in smaller teams to create recommendations that include all of these findings. I planned, I'll maybe do a first draft, like, again, I was on the board, and then circulate all that to you. I only have so many, please mark it up, like I would be on the board, put in what you don't like, take it, call me, whatever, okay? And we ought to be able to meet the deadline if we can. And if you think more needs to be done outside the 4 things that we were asked to do, I don't see any reason why we can't say that. I don't think we can do that here, but we can encourage the city, like in terms of like drafting it, before I do more, might think. So with that, I'm going to entertain a motion to adjourn this meeting. Motion.
So moved. Second.
All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Thank you very, very much. Thank you. So. This